Hello, wanted to make a quick video for you to show you how to do the pathology paper. And of course the instructions are there for you on the Canvas homepage, but in case you wanted some elaboration on those, that's what this video is for. So if you go to the Canvas homepage, which is where I am, this should be the view that you see. The pathology paper is right near the top, and so if you click on that, it'll take you to the instructions. So the gist of the pathology paper, what is it? The idea here is to introduce you to scientific reading and writing in this really early course in both the physical education program and also in the human performance program. And so the idea is to get you thinking about, I'm going to use pathologies, but to get you thinking about research and how that might be incorporated into some of your work, but also just to expose you to reading research, hopefully fairly early in your program. So you can see there the important stuff in bold. So what we're looking for is a 3-page paper, double-spaced, 12-point font, Times New Roman. Don't mess with the margins, just leave the default. And then one of the primary things I'm looking for is that you have at least 2 peer-reviewed journal articles. Well, what is that? So the peer review process is basically that if you are writing an academic article, and typically they are research findings, but not always. What you'll do is you'll prepare your manuscript, and then, so when I'm writing something, I prepare a manuscript, and then you submit it to the journal. So for example, the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. And then what the journal does is they take your name off of it, the author's name, and then they send it out to 2 peer reviewers. So those 2 people have an expertise in the area that your article covers. So for example, if the article is on adaptations to strength training, they'll send it to 2 people who specialize in that. Those 2 reviewers don't know who you are as the author, and then similarly, you don't know who they are. So they're blind reviewers, and so they read through your manuscript, they make comments about things that you could fix, maybe some things that you overlooked, maybe you had problems with your control group or your sample group or just the way you carried out the study, those kinds of things. And then they send those comments back to the journal and say, okay, this is either a great article and we should accept it without any changes, which is extremely rare, or they'll say we can accept it, but the author needs to make these minor changes, or we can accept it, but the author needs to make these massive changes, or this is not a good article and we should reject this, and this should not be published in the journal. And so typically the author gets a chance to respond, and so they'll go through most of the time, unless the article is just not bad or not good or completely unsuited for that journal, the author will go back through and make the changes, resubmit it, and then hopefully eventually the article will get accepted, and then it gets published in a peer-reviewed journal. So in terms of peer-reviewed publications, typically it has journal somewhere in the name. So for example, you can see here, I list a bunch of different journals related to sports medicine. So you've got the American Journal of Sports Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association, Clinics in Sports Medicine, etc. So what I'm looking for is that you have 2 articles that come from peer-reviewed journals like that. And I've included a sample article that is also in that same module. So if you go back here, there's a sample paper, and not coincidentally, that is mine. So this is an article that I published in a peer-reviewed journal called Strength and Conditioning Journal with a physical therapist friend of mine 4 years ago. And so the article itself is similar in layout to the pathology paper that I want you to write. So we go through and actually describe the pathology. So the pathology in this case, it's a low back stress fracture. It's called a spondylolysis, in case you're curious how to pronounce that word. But it's a low back stress fracture is what it is. And so we go through and explain what that injury is, the causes of it, and then how to fix it, in this case through exercise. So I put this article up there for a couple reasons. One is so that you can see what a peer-reviewed article looks like. So if you pull something off of the internet that doesn't look pretty similar to this, where it's got lots of citations. So for example, we cite the incidence of low back pain, and then it has a little 65 in parentheses. Well, if you go back to the very back couple pages to number 65, keep scrolling down a little bit. There we go. Then you can see the source where we got that information. So we got that from another peer-reviewed article. So the articles that you find should have both in-text citations, which is what those numbers are in parentheses. So it should have both in-text citations and then works cited or bibliography, whatever, however they want to refer to it, references at the very end of the document. If your article that you've pulled doesn't look similar to this, it's probably not a peer-reviewed article and you probably want to find something else. And I mention that because that's one of the biggest areas where people lose points on this project, is that they include like a newspaper article or something from WebMD or Healthline or something like that that may be a reputable source, but is not actually a peer-reviewed source. That's one of the things I would caution you about is, while there's good information on the Mayo Clinic, that's not a peer-reviewed source. So that actually wouldn't count as one of your sources. So what you pull needs to look pretty similar to this. So the question that I have included here then is, how do you find a peer-reviewed source? And there's several different ways to do it. One way would be to go through the library. And so, as you can see, if you want more information on peer-reviewed sources, there's a nice little link here. So now we're on to the how do you find a peer-reviewed source? Well, how you find it, as mentioned, there's a couple different ways. So one way is to go to our library's site. And so you can use databases here. So if you click on that, it'll take you to databases. What databases are subject-based groups of journals. So for example, one of the ones I'm going to have you choose is Medline. So if you go to the M, click on that, and we'll scroll down a little bit, and we'll go to Medline, because these are all medical journals. Could be sports medicine, could be nursing, could be gastroenterology, any number of other medical specialties will be grouped under Medline. So we're going to click on that, and then we are going to search for a pathology. So with respect to the pathology for this class, I want you to choose something related to this class. So remember, this class has primarily covered the nervous system. So we've included the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. We've included the peripheral nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the peripheral nervous system. We've talked about joints. We've talked about connective tissue some. We've talked about muscles and bones. So those are pretty much the main things that we've talked about in here. So not a lot of breadth in terms of topics, but a lot of depth, as you know, on each of them. So your topics might include things like an ACL sprain, might include muscular dystrophy, might include Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, any sort of like peripheral nervous system issue that you can think of or that you're aware of. Sometimes people do like conditions that family members have had, which is always interesting because it's personal and then they get to learn more about it. But you can also do muscle strains, ligament sprains, various joint injuries, so meniscus tears, those kinds of things. So for the sake of this, once I'm in Medline, I'm going to look up an Achilles rupture. So I click on that, and it'll pull up a bunch of peer-reviewed articles on Achilles ruptures. And so one of the things you'll see here is this one has the full text of the article linked, but this one doesn't. And so what you can do is come over here to full text, and then it'll knock out most of those things that you won't have access to. So this one is a case report, and so this one will work. So we'll click on that, and it'll take us to the full text version of the article in a second while it loads. There we go. All right, so it'll pull that up, and then there's your article. And again, that's going to look pretty similar to the one that I showed you earlier. So you can see there that they have citations in here. So he has, they have incidents. So there's a citation there. There's the little superscript number 4. And so again, this is a case report about one individual person, but this will work because it's a peer-reviewed article. Or we can go back, and then you can find a number of other things. So risk of rupture in patients with tendinopathy and a bunch of other things, right? So those would all work. So you can do Medline. Another thing that you can do is you can group in another database. So the other database that I would recommend is called Sport Discus. Discus like the thing that you throw if you're in track, because that includes some sports medicine journals as well. So I'm going to include that database as well. Click on OK. And then we'll search for the same thing again, see if it brings up any more articles. Again, I'm going to limit to full text. And there you go. So now we got an additional article about football players, so that'll work. One thing I would ask of you is to try to get relatively recent articles, so preferably like 2010 or later. You don't have to, but that's my preference. Articles from 1980 oftentimes aren't all that helpful. So preferably 2010 or newer. Anyway, so there's one way to find journal articles. Another thing that you can do is actually go to the library's homepage and you can look in particular journals. So for example, I want to look at clinics in sports medicine. So you can look at any of the ones that I've listed in the instructions. And so here I'm going to look at the American Journal of Sports Medicine or clinics in sports medicine. Both of those are good. So we're going to search for the journal title. And then you want online access. And then full text is available here, so click on that. And it'll probably make me sign in here in a second because I'm not on campus. Oh, maybe not. Okay, so now once we're into the journal, and obviously it's still loading, but once we're in the journal, whoops, we can search in this journal. So again, we're going to do Achilles rupture. And this should pop up all things that have linked full text. So there's acute Achilles ruptures. Talked about the peroneal tendons, so there's those. So this is a really good route to go if you don't want to mess with the databases. Either the American Journal of Sports Medicine or clinics in sports medicine are both really, really helpful, and you'll find articles that are fairly approachable, especially in clinics in sports medicine. Now, obviously, there's a fair amount of jargon, but these articles can be a lot more approachable and a lot more useful to you than some of the things that you'll find if you just search the databases. So worth your time to check out the American Journal of Sports Medicine and clinics in sports medicine. So that's one way to go. And another way to find peer-reviewed articles is to go to Google Scholar. So what you do is type scholar.google.com and then type in your injury or your pathology. And so one of the things that you can already see on Google Scholar that becomes a little problematic is not all of them have full text. So this one does. So elongation after repair. Let's go to Achilles rupture in women. Check that out and see what that looks like. So one of the hardest parts with Google is that oftentimes you won't actually be able to access the article. And so maybe something that looks really interesting or really useful and then you can't get it. I think this one we can. Looks like we can. Good. And sometimes it helps too to have signed into the library's website, and then it'll make it easier to find things. So anyway, that one would work too. So you can use the library site or you can use Google Scholar. Either way, but with Google Scholar, be careful. Make sure that you do get peer-reviewed articles. Sometimes there are non-peer-reviewed things that show up. So there's that. And then in terms of citations, so there's different. I want you to use APA citations. So that's one thing I would be careful about too. So when you're doing your article, a couple things. These are also areas where people lose points. Make sure that you cite your sources. So if you say, for example, I'll cheat and go back to mine, that low back pain affects adolescents, up to 36% of adolescents annually, be sure to include where that source came from. So any little factoid that you throw at me in this article, in this paper that you're writing, make sure that there's a citation for it. Now, that said, remember you have to get 2 peer-reviewed articles, but you can have other sources. So if you have 2 peer-reviewed articles, plus you want to use Mayo Clinic or Medline or, or Healthline or any of those other ones, as long as it's a good source, then you can include those as well on top of your peer-reviewed sources. So make sure you cite where the facts came from. The other thing that you'll notice here is that we didn't quote, and in general, you don't quote. So one of the things I'd like to see from you as well is that you rewrite what the authors said in your own words and then just provide a citation. Because that's one of the comments that I make the most frequently when I'm reading these papers and grading them, is that I don't want to see quotations, especially long quotations. I want to see that you rewrite it in your own words and then cite the source. So I want to see your writing, not their writing. And then the other thing I would caution you against is sometimes people string together like really long quotes, like a full paragraph and quote it, and then string together another paragraph and then try to count that as their paper. That doesn't count. So I want to see your writing, not theirs. So be really careful about the use of quotes. I would recommend only use quotes if you need the author's original wording. If you can get away without it, don't use a quotation. Try to paraphrase as much as you can. And then the other thing, I have my little notes here about things I often take off points for. So make sure you cite both in text, which is this, and then you also include a reference page. So you should have, there's me, there's Justin. You should have references or bibliography, whatever you want to put, and then your 2 plus however many additional ones you have on there as well. So that's how you cite, and again, here's more information. So the APA format is what you're going to use in your later classes, so I want you to be familiar with that. Essentially what you do is rather than putting a number as your citation, you would include the author's last name and the year of the article. So it's a little bit different, but the same concept. And then I have the layout of the paper here. So what I want you to do is to describe the injury to me. So, what happens, tell me about the anatomy. And another big thing that I'm hopeful that you're able to do is to show me what you learned in the class, or try as much as you can to apply what you learned in the class. So for example, if you were talking about spondylolysis, you would talk about the anatomy of the lumbar spine and the it's not the best word, but the anatomy of a vertebrae, right? So talk about the pedicle, talk about the lamina, talk about the facet joints, all of those kinds of things, and show me that you know what those are and then how they come into play with this injury. And then as you can see, we're looking for signs and symptoms associated with the injury, how it can affect their health, what can we do about it, and then if we can't cure it, why not? So for something like Alzheimer's disease, obviously there's no cure for that. But are there thoughts on what could be done potentially in terms of treatments in the future? That would be helpful to know. And so it mentions the sample article that I've included. All right, so I'll try not to make this video too long. Looks like we're already at 17 minutes. So anyway, look it over. Email me if you have any questions. I'm happy to help you. If you can't find articles, or if you're struggling for ideas for the paper or any of those kinds of things, be sure to email me. So good luck, and I look forward to reading them.